the architectural miracle built on enslaved labor. There is a particular kind of lie embedded in the stone of great buildings, the lie of silent authorship. When tourists photograph the White House, when students walk the grounds of Ivy League universities, when travelers gaze at the grandeur of ancient walls stretching across mountain ridges, they rarely stop to ask whose hands shaped those stones, whose backs bent under the weight of those beams, whose lives were consumed in the making of what the world calls beautiful. History has a habit of celebrating the architect and erasing the laborer, of enshrining the commissioner and burying the enslaved. But the record, when examined honestly, tells a story far more complex and far more disturbing than any commemorative plaque dares to admit. 2 of Washington, D.C.'s most iconic structures, the White House and the United States Capitol, were built in large part by enslaved African Americans. National Archives holdings include wage rolls, promissory notes, and vouchers that document the work done by enslaved people on both historic structures. In 1791, Pierre L'Enfant, who planned the city of Washington, leased African American slaves from their masters to clear the sites for the President's house and the Capitol. Once the land was cleared, the city's Board of Commissioners tried to recruit laborers from Europe and America. Unable to find as many workers as they needed, they turned to enslaved people. Most hauled building materials and sawed lumber, but others performed skilled labor such as carpentry, stone cutting, and bricklaying. The symbolism is staggering and almost unbearable. The house in which the leader of the free world wakes each morning, the rotunda beneath which democracy is debated and laws are passed, these monuments to liberty were raised by people who had none. The White House Historical Association notes that stonemason Colin Williamson trained enslaved people on the spot at the government's quarry in Aquia, Virginia, where they quarried and cut the rough stone that was later dressed and laid by Scottish masons to erect the walls of the President's house. Their names were recorded not as citizens, not as craftsmen, but as line items, payments for Negro hire, a bureaucratic phrase that stripped human beings of identity while extracting their labor with surgical efficiency. And yet the erasure did not stop at the Capitol. Thomas Jefferson's Monticello estate was built by enslaved people who quarried limestone, made bricks, and constructed the house's frame. Jefferson, the man who wrote that all men are created equal, held over 600 enslaved people during his lifetime. The contradiction does not merely complicate his legacy, it defines it. When former President Barack Obama toured Monticello with French President François Hollande in 2014, he acknowledged it plainly. The house represents the complicated history of the United States, built by the very people whose humanity its founding documents refuse to recognize. The story extends far beyond Virginia and Washington. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the oldest public university in the country, harnessed slave labor to build many of its early structures when it was founded in 1793, and enslaved people continued to maintain its buildings until 1865. Knowledge was constructed literally on the backs of those who were legally forbidden from acquiring it. Harvard Law School itself was financially supported by Isaac Royal Jr., a slave owner whose wealth stemmed primarily from enslaved Africans working on sugar plantations. The institutions that trained generations of lawyers, doctors, and leaders drew their founding capital directly from the machinery of human bondage. The pattern is not uniquely American. It is a wound running through the entire history of monumental architecture. The Great Wall of China, begun in 221 BCE, is still nicknamed the longest cemetery on Earth, a reference to the more than 300 Las Cindras convicts, slaves, and conscripted workers who died helping to create it. Ancient Rome's baths of Caracalla were built by thousands of laborers working 12-hour days for 6 consecutive years. The grandeur that fills history books and tourist brochures is inseparable from suffering that those same books tend to minimize or omit entirely. Enslaved and free. Africans were largely responsible for the construction of early New York City, clearing land, building forts, mills, bridges, stone houses, the first city hall, the docks, city prisons, churches, the city hospital, and Francis Tavern. The very name Wall Street is born of slavery. Enslaved Africans built a wall in 1653 to protect Dutch settlers, and that walkway of pointed logs running river to river later became known as Wall Street, the center of world finance. The global economy as we know it was, in its physical foundations, assembled by people who were treated as property. What does it mean to call something a miracle of architecture when its construction was a crime against humanity? The Colosseum draws millions of visitors a year. Plantation houses across the American South are marketed as charming venues for weddings. University campuses named after slave owners host diversity initiatives on the same lawns that enslaved people were once forced to maintain. The aesthetic and the atrocity have been carefully separated in public memory. The beauty preserved, the brutality archived. The buildings, statues, and monuments we sometimes blindly pass by each day represent a collective history and culture. People think of slavery as primarily a Southern institution, without recognizing how integral it was to the development of communities across the entire colonial world. Acknowledging the full truth of these structures is not an act of destruction. It is an act of honesty. A civilization that cannot look clearly at the hands that built it is a civilization still choosing convenience over conscience. The stones do not lie. The archives do not lie. The skeletons of workers found at construction sites across the ancient and modern world, bearing the marks of arthritis, fractures, and exhaustion, do not lie. What we choose to celebrate and whose names we choose to remember says everything about who we believe deserves to be seen. The miracle was never a miracle. It was labor. Stolen, brutal, uncompensated labor. And the least we owe those who performed it is the truth.